More than happy to help you though.
Never did.
Then see, and that's perfect. So lei in Hawaii has been a part of Hawaii and our tradition for many years. So a lot of my ike, or my knowledge about lei making, comes from my ohana, or my hanai ohana from Hawaii, the Ka'avaloa family. Specifically my hanai sister, Pi'ilani, who is a hula practitioner and does a lot of work with the Native Hawaiian cultural practice of hula and the lei making involved in hula. So a lot of you may already know that. You guys may know that leis are very popular in Hawaii for tourists, right? They love having those shirts. I got laid in Hawaii and they think it's so funny. But none of them ever learn about the true importance of lei and the meaning of it until someone tells them or shares it with them. And if no one shares it with them, then of course they'll never know, right? So one of the things that we like to do, or I think is important to do, is to share that mana'o with people. And so, do any of you have any special stories of lei making, or that you guys have learned in your ohana? Times when you've had to make it? So for instance, I'll share one. I know for me, my father died when I was 3 years old, and he's buried at Punch Bowl. So every Veterans Day, they always make leis, and Memorials Day, and Memorials Day also. And so that was one of the things that I enjoyed doing, right? We always had a plumeria tree in the yard. Most of my family always had plumeria tree in the yard, because that seemed to be the one staple every family I knew had. Because when we needed a lei, we would make one. But what about any of you four? Any stories that you can remember that just are so fond memories that you have of making lei?
I made a bougainvillea lei.
Oh my gosh!
Yeah, and
I've only seen those.
And it was, oh my gosh.
Yeah, that's why they look hard.
Because my neighbor we lived in Aleomano, and we were on the side with that stairs.
Yes.
And so there's like a cliff, right?
Yes.
And so I had to go in the bushes picking them, and they also had what is that called? Rosewood, yeah. So I had all the thorns too in there. So yeah, I got all poked up and had to pick plenty of flowers.
Yes, because those are right to make one lei.
One lei. So I only did it once.
What did you think of it after?
It was plenty of work, but then after it was really beautiful, and I appreciate it more knowing the work that I had to do to put into it. I don't know what I did with. I can't remember what I did with the lei. Just
that's what I was going to ask you next. Like, was it for a special occasion? You don't remember?
I can't remember. Just remember all the work involved, and then at the end, finally getting it done. It was like, wow.
Wow, that's a really nice story. I like that. Thank you. What about anyone else? Any stories you can remember or think of? Okay.
I remember with my grandmother, because our backyard had crown flower.
Ah, yes, another popular.
Going and picking the crown flower and getting all the milk sap all over me, and so I learned how to start from the middle first, pick the middle part, the middle of the tree, and then work outward. Because if you work on the outward, the sap continues to drop.
Yes.
And so instead of just getting it on your hands and arms, you end up getting it in your hair and on your body. That's what I learned when having to go and pick with my grandma.
See, and that's a wonderful story, because when you pick plumeria, right? No one teaches you about that.
Right.
You just learn to avoid the milk.
Yes,
Right,
yes.
Right? You don't. But that is what an interesting way to think of it. I never thought about picking a plumeria that way, like starting from the inside and moving out to the outer branches. That's a wonderful story. Thank you. Anyone else? Okay, so Florence, you're gonna have to move up, because we're gonna have to have a partner at least. So I noticed that most of you are almost done with your lei. So what I'd like you to do now is I'd like you to share your lei. Oh, wrong way, sorry. Share your lei with a neighbor next to you. And I want you to look at each other's lei and share what you see with your neighbor. And that's as specific as I'm going to get. What do you see? What do you observe about the lei? What do you notice?
changed my mind because I think there was only like 2 different colors and I knew they were yellow and it's African. So for each one you get a different color straw to use. And yeah. So you need
That's one thing like that. Once you get the flower, you have to use it.
okay. So multicolored. Oh yeah, just flower straw. Yeah.
Oh, you picked the
What do you notice?
I noticed hers and you allowed colors.
I thought about taking
So different colors,
yeah,
okay?
color beach.
Both of yours are really very pretty.
Yeah, rainbow.
Nice. What do you notice about hers?
That hers and is one solid, continuous flower color.
Okay.
And, but I like how your straws were multicolored. It was all different colors. So it showed that you're consistent in your work, but yet you still have a
Yeah.
playful side.
I did notice that I
Flashing
didn't,
color.
I
Playfulness.
didn't have it in my stringing of it.
So it wasn't, it wasn't a conscious thing for you to make them face all the same way.
Cool.
That's what I noticed about yours.
Yeah, I think,
And this one doesn't have on the other side.
yeah, I found that's
Yeah, see, it doesn't have it. So you did use the one light.
yeah, the imprinting,
Yeah.
yeah.
So I liked your conversations about what you noticed, right? And everyone, when you leave something like this, okay, so that this is an activity that you could possibly do as a classroom teacher with your students, regardless of what age, really. And as a math teacher, as I get a little bit further into my discussion, I'm gonna connect this to math. But the one thing I like to try to do, and I like to try and encourage teachers I work with to do, is to really make it open-ended, and then to walk around and listen what they talk about, because it doesn't always. It may lead you in different pathways that might still be very beneficial to the discussion that you might have for the day, right? And the nice thing about lei specifically is it's a cultural practice here in Hawaii, and it's something that, like, two of you shared, is something that is part of their lives. And so it's a way for the students to really share more about themselves, share stories about themselves, right? And it's kind of like this picture, right? When you ask someone, what do you notice, right? What do you see? What do you observe? Because if people look at this, you're going to get a number of different answers, right? Some that will connect to what you're talking about today, and some that you won't connect to what you're talking about today. So, it's Melissa? Melissa, okay. What did you notice about, in fact, let's talk about both of your lei. What did you notice?
Yeah, I noticed that she had a pattern, she used the color pattern, that the flowers have a embossing on one
Okay.
side, and she didn't, put it the same way so that embossing is all the same
Okay.
way, so she followed a pattern. I asked her if she did a pattern with the straws, but she said there wasn't enough colors, but she did kind of start a little bit of the pattern.
Okay, nice. How was it the same or different from your lei?
Oh, we said that we did the same thing, straw, flower, straw, flower, straw, flower. I did put a straw at the end, she has one straw. I would count so that I have an extra straw.
Oh, so when you picked up your supplies.
Yes.
So let me ask you this. Now, if you had been given the opportunity to come back a second time to fill the rest of your yarn, would you have done the same thing?
Me? Or,
Either.
okay. For me, because I had a pattern going, I would have finished off. I like the color combinations, that's why.
Okay.
But I would have continued with the pattern. But I don't know where she would have gone because she really didn't have, she took all of the colors. So there wasn't really a pattern of colors. And even with the straw, she has a different straw for each one, yeah? For each one. So the only pattern is the flower straw, but everything else is not.
Okay,
following a color pattern.
okay.
And if I had it through, I would take more flowers. I was gonna take more, but then I should have figured we were gonna make a lei. I didn't think about that. kind of like Lolo, you know, it's like obvious you're gonna make a lei, but I didn't think of a lei. And I just took one of every color because I didn't want to be greedy and take more. I thought it was already, I thought it was already being greedy to take one of each color.
Gwendolyn, what did you notice about your two lei?
About her layer one.
Both?
Both are, well, hers I noticed is like a rainbow color.
Okay.
Different
So she
colors.
used one of each color too?
Yes,
Okay.
yeah. And then, mine was just solid, as I love to have solid colors.
Ah,
And then in between, I wanted to have brightness to bring up the solid color.
okay. I did notice that, but do you have a pattern to yours, you think?
Yeah, I do. Well, I was trying to make it just the straw and flower. At the end, I didn't know that I had too much of flowers, so I just put it together to make it even.
Ah.
And then just like Melissa, I was trying to think that I didn't want to grab too much because then I was like greedy. I was gonna have
You could have checked out the room, right? Checked out the environment and made an assumption about, oh, maybe I could take a little more, right? Okay, very nice. So, obviously, the one thing I'm going to hit on, right? How does this connect to math? Thoughts? Patterns. Anything else? Counting, very good. Patterns is a big deal, okay? Because really that's all math is. Math is just about patterns. No matter what someone tells you, calculus, you know, algebra, trigonometry, math is about patterns, period. That's all it is about. It's about some kind of pattern in your life, okay? So let's say that this is what you do. So you take this back to your class and you say, you know what, I'm going to try this because I love making paper leis. And maybe if you are fortunate enough to live on a piece of property that you have all kinds of flower leis, you might be lucky enough to bring in actual flowers for your students. But say you were to do this, and whatever grade it is. So we're going to start at the youngest grade. So when we talk about patterns, what comes to mind about math? Think of something you might have done in the past that really comes to mind when you think about patterns. Any thoughts?
When you learn how to add, you know,
Okay.
it always starts with add one more.
Add one more, okay?
add one-
That's more complex than I was thinking of.
Oh,
But how
okay.
many of you remember doing like this? Right? So what comes next? Right? This is a simpler pattern than being able to add to one. And we're going to get to that though. Right? So you can, a simple project like this where the kids get involved, they get to do hands-on work, they can work as groups, they talk with each other. Now you ask them, so if you're looking at, so I would say, Florence, looking at your lei, would you be able to tell me what comes next?
Yeah.
Okay,
Exactly.
so,
Because of the pattern, so after the yellow, definitely the blue would come after that.
right.
Yeah.
So what if I asked you this though, Florence, what would come next in Mele's lei? Mele is this one here.
Nelly?
This is Mele.
This is mine.
Oh,
What would come next there?
If it's to look at my lei, what do you think would?
Flowers.
so where's the end?
Yeah, so that's the part.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Where's
'cause
the
there's-
beginning?
Because there's
Mhm.
two straws at this
Yes.
end, so I'm
Yeah.
wondering if that's gonna
That would
start
have been
something
my
else.
end because I
Oh, okay.
was shy.
Okay.
I didn't count.
Yeah.
I just grabbed.
She didn't count.
Because if I looked at the left side, I would have thought, well, maybe she's gonna set something else because there's two straws there now.
Right.
Oh, a different
Yeah.
pattern.
Different
right?
pattern.
See, so it's different, right?
Yeah.
And but it's a great conversation to have because being able to figure out what comes next is always important. And that's where it comes a little bit, now moves to what else we can do with it, right? So we can go from something as concrete and simple as simple patterns, right? So if I look back at this one and I ask you what comes next, some kids will tell you, oh, a blue comes next.
Right.
But
They're
we want them to be specific, right? A blue what? Is it a blue line, a blue triangle, right? You want them to be able to notice the specificity of patterns, right? So if I were to look, like let's say if I were looking at Gwendolyn's, I would say probably a single purple, any color straw, and it would be followed by a whole bunch of single purples and then another bunch of purples. right? So the description is important too, that we want students to be able to do, to speak about their reasoning, right? And have evidence behind it. So what else? Well, it comes back to patterns again, right? But this time, kind of like what Florence was talking about, we can have patterns with numbers, right? So we have -3, -1, 1, and 3, right? So if I talk about that, what's the pattern? So this is now, so I just took the same project and I went from something a kindergartner could do, right? To now, this is something that 7th, 8th, 9th grade can do now. And you can use the same activity, same culture-based type activity. So what's the pattern? Can anyone figure this part out? Agreed? Is that everybody agreed? It's +2, or does someone have a different answer?
I would have gone back and repeated it, not even thinking.
Ah, see, so and that's a good
the
discussion to
equation.
have. So if
I
we
would've
were in
just
class, right,
automatically-
Melly would have
Oh, yeah,
said, oh, it would be
-3.
-3, -1, 1, and 3, right? Is that incorrect? It might not be, right? It might not be, because that's a valid thinking, right? Oh, I'm seeing 3s and I'm seeing 1s. Some of them are positive, some of them are negative. So maybe that's the pattern, right? And then there's some who immediately jump to, oh, we're just adding 2, right? So in this case, you have that discussion, because not one is wrong, because I gave no direction, right? However, yes, what I was looking for is how do I get from one to the other, right? I'm adding 2 in each sense. And then you would have a discussion with your students about that, right? Was Melly incorrect? No, she wasn't. No directions were given other than what is the pattern, right? I didn't ask you what you did to get from one number to the next, because I wasn't specific. But it's a great conversation starter, right? Because Melly would be able to share her ideas on why she would have thought, oh, well, don't you just do -3, -1, 1, 3, -3, -1, 1, 3, that's the pattern? Well, yeah, you're right. And as a teacher, even if I wasn't thinking that, I have to admit she is correct, because that is a pattern. Because I didn't give enough information, right? Kind of like when you all walked in and I just said, pick up a few.
Yeah.
Right.
You were like, how much is a few? I don't know. I just said a few. What does a few mean to you, right? So it's a great way to use open-ended questioning to get discussion about, right? And then lead up to what we're talking about here, which, well, actually, I should have been more specific and asked you, what did I do to get from one number to the next? Right? So how do we go? What greater math can we still do? Right? What greater math can we still do? What more abstract? Much more abstract can we get? Well, here is one. So now, if I know that my pattern that I talked about, right, was adding 2, what happens if I just want you to give me, is there an equation or an expression or some way of telling me, if I had no idea how many number spaces I wanted you to go out, but you would be able to calculate that number for me, right? So this is more abstract now. So now I'm going to, right, where can we go? Well, what about this? Okay, so you'll notice some things. So I have a -3, you've seen, but it's on the bottom, right? I have a 1 here, you saw, on the bottom. A 1 on top, a -1 on top. Okay? So this is a game that I like to play with my students when I was teaching. I was back in the classroom, where they had to figure out what all the question marks were, based on the clues that I gave them. So if you were to look at this, say your students, and obviously we had math before this, right? We had lessons before this, so they kind of knew what I was looking for, right? What is the most important clue on this table? You guys might have to think hard. It's been a while, I know. If you're not math teachers.
Exactly.
There's one absolute most important clue on this table. I'll give you a hint. Well, I'm just going to tell you the clue. So this is the most important clue when it comes to math, right? Because I have question marks on both the top and the bottom, and these are the only 2 numbers I get that has both. right? So there must be a relationship between these two numbers that I would need to figure out to find my question marks. Okay? So this takes students to linear equations. And this has to do with delay. Okay, so let me connect. So this is why, this is where I'm coming to the point of what I wanted to share with all of you today, right? Subject matter knowledge is important, no matter what subject you teach. Because if you don't know, if as a math teacher, I had no idea what this table was and how I got the relationships between what I did with the pattern, right, and the number pattern, because they're all related, right? It's all about patterns, right? One is just color, and that's the simplest pattern we can have, color and shape, followed by number, right? Where we're just adding, and that builds onto this, right? If as a math teacher, I didn't realize that all of those things were connected, it's difficult for me to think of activities like what you did with the lathe. Okay, so I'm gonna jump from here, right, and talk a little bit about, because we're not gonna you don't need to figure that out, okay? But this is basically what my students would be able to come with. So based on that table, they would figure out that that's the equation. So this is what we used to fill in the question marks, right? But I built up to that, right? All using an activity of a lathe. And so I would always be able to tie back. Well, Kumu, we don't understand though. How does this go back to the lathe? Okay, well, let's think about this. Let's say you had, so I'm going to use, just because hers is I'm going to use Florence's because hers is a very distinct pattern, right? So let's say we had an assembly. Our class was required to make 20 of these lathe, right? And I told you, before we do anything, you need to create a material list for me so that I knew exactly how much of everything to buy. Because it's not coming like this to you. Okay? So that's where that kind of math comes in. And so that's how I would show them. But if you don't know that as a teacher, right, whether it's math, whether it's social studies, whether it's English, if you don't know the very root of where the content that you're teaching comes from, it's very difficult for you to be able to create any kind of activity, whether it's culture-based, place-based, which is a part of culture-based, right, or just anything. Any kind of project activity, if you don't know enough of your subject to be able to take it all the way back to linear equations are just patterns. And it actually is built from patterns as simple as colors and shapes, right? But if you don't know that, right, because these are also they're called linear equations, and that's what it's called in class, right? Most of you know it as this. Because you can talk to any kid, and I can guarantee you a kid will tell you, what do you remember from algebra? I remember y equals mx plus b. What does that mean? I have no idea. Right? Then what was the point of you learning it? Because you had to, right? And that's where, that to me is the difference, right? That to me is where teachers who are really good in class can become great in class. If they're able to take something concrete and attach it to something as abstract as this. And this is a very abstract algebra concept. Because, like I said, most students, as you guys were all here nodding, all they remember is y equals mx plus b. I remember it has to do with a line. Okay? So this is another representation of this is also called a regression. And regression has to do with patterns. And it's always a pattern of, I typically am adding something. Okay? So, whether you teach math or not, I'll teach you the pattern, right? Because this is something important. Like, I think people should know this. So, whenever you go back to, you remember we had a -3, -1, 1, and 3? So, and we knew that it was adding 2.
Yeah.
Right? Does anyone know where the adding 2 would show up in this equation? Which of those numbers was the adding 2?
Plus B.
See? Everyone thinks that, right? It's the plus b. because you're adding. But it's not. Where does the 2 show up?
Oh,
Okay.
Right? The multiplication is the regression piece. This tells me that I'm going to be repeatedly adding 2 to my last answer. Right? So this is the regression. Regression means what comes repeatedly. So I'm repeatedly adding 2. And yes, it's multiplication. And your kids are going to say, that's multiply though. How come I'm not multiplying by 2? Well, but what is multiplication? It's adding of groups, right? And in this case, we're adding 2 groups. Okay? What is the plus 3 part? It is some more. Very good. Okay? And that's a great answer. Yes, it's more. It's more than something. But the key to this part of the y equals mx plus b equation is that that's where I start. When I have nothing, so when I start with nothing here, I'm always going to have 3. It's your starting point. Okay? So the other way I like to look at it is, let's say I'm in a race. Okay? So that's where I'm going to take it back like to something even more concrete, right? Students love racing, right? They get racing. Okay? So I'm going to take my kids outside, and I'm going to say, okay, I'm going to line up 5 of you, we're going to time you, and we're going to run. Then the next 5, and then the next 5, and then we're going to log all of your time.